Hello, Brad here, just to say we're super proud that the Friday 5pm podcast is sponsored by the Malt Miller, the UK's best home brew store.
We use the Malt Miller for all of our homebrew experiments, as well as tapping them up for advice and binging on their awesome YouTube channel all the time.
That's why whenever we release a homebrew video, we put a recipe kit live on the Malt Miller, so you can brew with the exact same amazing ingredients that we did. The same ingredients used by pro brewers.
So alongside the Malt Miller's nitro-flushed hops, cold-stored yeast and milled-to-order malts, you can pick up recipe kits for our 5 Points Best Bitter, Russian River West Coast IPA, and now the fastest beer in the world, a hazy session IPA that goes from grain to glass in less than 48 hours.
Sign up to their newsletter at tinyurl.com/Malt Miller to get 5% off your first order. With the Malt Miller's amazing customer service and Johnny's 48-hour recipe, you could order the ingredients on a Monday and be drinking the beer by the weekend.
Speaking of which, it's Friday.
It's 5pm.
So enjoy this week's Friday 5pm podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 6 of The Bubble. This week we are talking to Evin from the Kernel about cheese.
Yeah, so we had a huge social response to this one, which was totally out of the blue. I just put a photo of some bottles of Kernel with the mixer. I thought I was being arty. It's quite a shit photo, but everyone's very excited to hear this one, and so you should be. We do talk quite a bit about beer, because it's almost impossible not to when you're being plied with Kernel Saison, export stout, pale ales. But yeah, the main thing we wanted to talk about with Evin was cheese, because not everyone knows this, but his origin story is he was working in cheese, went over to America to educate some Americans about cheese, because all they know is 100 slices of American cheese. And yeah, they showed him beer, and sort of his analytical brain latched onto beer like it had with cheese, going, well, similar processes, there's origins, there's sort of a farmhouse approach to some of these styles that he took a huge interest to, and that's kind of where Kernel came from. So you get the origin story and then a ton of stuff about mountain cheesemakers.
Yeah, I just really love going down to the Kernel. They're sort of one of my first beers, like, to get me into craft beer properly when I first moved to London. And just sitting down with him, he's a real fascinating person, and he knows so much about cheese and obviously about making really good beer. And sort of listening to those parallels, and just, I mean, his brain is a sponge when it comes to making artisan.
Just needs a little squeeze and you're away. Yeah.
And it was really enjoyable, and we tried some amazing cheeses. I still don't know if I'm any the wiser and how a lot of cheese is made, because it's so complicated, but it was a really, really good day out.
Yeah, so it was a great day out. We spent a couple of hours, well beyond what we recorded in the podcast, chatting about beer and cheese, and the beer scene as well. And they are actually reopening an arch, hopefully very soon, so you'll be able to have the experience that we did, hopefully with such delicious cheese. But before then, tune into this. This is Evin O'Riordain of Kernel talking about fromage.
Oh, I think it's got a yeast infection. Yeast infection.
Do you want to talk us through the cheese, Evin? Saying you are the expert. What are we?
What are we going to start with?
Let's start with the cheese that you've brought, which is under the stinky blue that Rob's afraid, like gingerly removing the paper.
Most of my experience is with British cheeses. So what we tend to have, because of our neighbours, are things that hail from the British Isles. You've brought some as well, so that's good. My knowledge of French cheese is less specific. However, we do have one of our team downstairs worked selling Comté cheese in the borough market for 3 years. Nothing but Comté. So I actually probably won't say anything about it. We'll just have to get Alex in to fill us in, because it's not my area of expertise. Which is not to say that it's not delicious, because Comté can be one of the best cheeses of all time. The Tom you've brought, I don't know any more about that.
Yeah, so I made a fool of myself by saying I brought this Tom cheese, And Tom is just the shape, right? It's like saying I've brought this bottle of beer.
like a truckle or something. You might, in cheese terms. It kind of just means form or shape, I think, in terms of. So you can have a Tom made of in anywhere from any type of milk.
Yeah.
As to which one it is, we'll just have to taste it and find out.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
part of the fun.
Exactly. So the two cheeses that you've put out are, I'm not going to guess, but one's pale and one's slightly yellow. Listeners.
Are you referring to that as the pale and that's the
I
yellow?
think that's the pale one. Yeah.
They are quite similar. I'll give you that, Johnny.
No, I know what you mean, but you could easily. Well, you couldn't swap them around, but either descriptor could work for either cheese. I pulled out some Lancashire because it's delicious, and there is a particular about cheeses like Lancashire and Cheshire specifically. There's an old-fashioned Englishness, maybe also like Wensleydale. Just there's an English taste which you never capture in any other part of the world, which is that sort of slightly lactic, yogurty crumbliness, and it's most specifically that texture. The texture is one thing you can never imitate on a larger scale with cheese production. You know, if a cheese is on a handmade scale, the curds are broken up by hand, the cheeses are packed into molds by hand, you get a certain texture, or you're looking for a certain texture, and different cheeses are made in different ways to get different textures. But the texture of something like Lancashire is just, it cannot be produced on a larger scale. So anytime you have something with that sort of texture, that just feels like it's, there's a man or a woman there doing that on their own with their fingers, and that's, just you feel that.
Yeah.
You feel that connection with the soil, with the animals, and with a historical tradition. And the cheese on the left is cheddar, and one of the reasons that cheddar is so ubiquitous now is because you can approximate a certain cheddary texture with a larger scale production. So in the sense that it lends itself to scaling a bit more than, say, other cheese recipes. Part of the process is slightly more amenable to industrialization to a degree. So that's one of the reasons why, a lot of the reason that cheddar is so ubiquitous now, I think, is because during especially the Second World War, all the resources, in this case milk, had to be pooled in the most efficient manner possible. So milk, there was no way of keeping milk fresh in those days, really. Refrigeration wasn't common. So turning it into cheese was the way of harvesting and keeping all of the, the protein, the energy, the calories, and all that sort of stuff. And obviously in service of the war effort, you want it in a form that would last a long time. Cheddar was this type of cheese that would fit into this newly industrialized process the best. And so basically all milk had to go into cheddar production for those years, and even after, at the exclusion of all the other cheese recipes out there. So that's why we have cheddar as a ubiquitous English cheese. Everywhere. But things like Cheshire and Lancashire, etc., Caerphilly, Wensleydale, all suffered not quite extinction, although in some cases they were extinct. Spark and Homemaker, the guys who make the blue cheese that you brought, make a red Leicester, which is another old recipe which before they revived had not been seen in an artisanal kind of farmhouse manner for a generation or two. What? Because all of the milk was taken and given to make cheddar.
Is there books on old recipes of cheese making and stuff that people are looking into to get different vintages? Yeah.
So there's a cheese historian out there. There's a Martin Kernel of cheese.
There are a couple. So I used to work at Neal's Yard Dairy. Randolph Hodgson was the man who set up Neal's Yard Dairy back in the late 70s. He's still, I don't know what's his position in the dairy anymore, but he basically moved to a farm in Hereford about 10 years ago and now lives there with his family. And basically what he's been doing is looking through old recipes and recreating them on a tiny little scale himself. And it's fascinating. I mean, the things that he's producing are really, they're nothing like
what we
any
perceive
of these
cheese
things,
to be.
especially with cheddar, because that's the one that's been kind of not necessarily perfected, but perfected in a kind of a slightly industrialized sense.
A bit like lager
Cheshire
has been in beer. It's become the thing that people think about when they think about
exactly.
cheese.
Yeah. The rhythm of cheese making doesn't give one quite the same ability to improvise as, say, we have in brewing. If you think of, say, winemakers as well, they only get one vintage a year to try and perfect what they do, so they don't tend to risk that by doing anything wacky or, so the same with cheesemakers. A Comté like that will be at least 18 months old. So, you've put a lot of effort into it, and you have to get all these things right in order for the cheese to come out well. So when you start tweaking what you're doing, the risk of you turning out something that's maybe not great it's quite a big risk to take.
Yeah.
So you kind of you understand why these sort of things aren't messed with too much. But also there's that link to tradition, that if you come from a background where cheese was made this way for generations, then there are good reasons that it was made that way for generations.
But
which isn't to say that you shouldn't go and look at those reasons and investigate what could be done better, or what was by accident, or what's essential to this recipe. But there isn't quite the sense of
playfulness.
Playfulness is the word I was going to use. Yeah, I wanted to say innovation, but
it's more like more like the lambic world, I suppose. It's a bit like you're more committed. It's in barrel for 1 year to 3 years.
Yes.
You can't play with it quite as much.
Yes.
Whereas with the more modern styles, you can just churn out in a matter of weeks.
That's exactly it. That's Lancashire, made by Graham Kirkham in Goosenar in Lancashire. There are not that many raw milk Lancashires still made, and there's still parts of the process, specifically with Lancashire, that are really old-fashioned. For example, with most cheeses, 1 day's milking will be a blend of morning and evening milk, and then they'll make cheese from that, and that will be a specifically separate batch to the next day's cheese making. Whereas with Lancashire, you'll always keep back a portion of the curd and let it sit out overnight, so it kind of ripens and sours, and then that bit would then be added to the next day's.
So it's almost Solera cheese
over a short period of time. But yes, but actually one of the fascinating things about, specifically in terms of thinking of modern cheese versus old-fashioned one, is with cheese, the starting point of turning milk into cheese is adding. Well, this is the thing. It's the modern way of looking at it, is adding starter culture, which is a little blend of bacteria that start the souring process. And so exactly, if you keep some of your curd one day to the next, you're allowing those souring bacteria to kind of keep going and going. A lot of the modern cheesemakers, cheese making, has the souring happen in a really quick fashion, because it's much more efficient to get it done in a couple of hours, whereas the old-fashioned recipes tend to take a longer period of time. So somebody making Stilton to an old recipe will let the curd sit out overnight and slowly get more acidity, whereas you can speed up that process by using a different bacterial starter to get things going quicker.
Is there a benefit to giving it longer?
Texturally, yes. But then economically speaking, you need more space, you need more equipment, the chances of something going wrong are much higher, so it tends not to be done that frequently. But that sort of time given to bacterial ripening of milk is one of the key differences between a lot of the old-fashioned recipes and the modern ones. We haven't really done this linearly, have we? We're already talking about things that we should have introduced ages ago. We've gone straight into the deep end of bacterial starter cultures. And we haven't even explained it properly, you see, so even I'm kind of thinking I didn't really explain that very well.
I think we could maybe rewind and start with your sort of journey into cheese. Where did that begin?
That would be... that makes more sense.
Yeah, let's do that. So,
that's the rewind.
Yeah, rewind button.
I grew up in cheese, so there's no journey at all. My dad is he's retired now, but was a professor of microbiology and dairy technology in Waterford, in the southeast of Ireland. So when I was 10, I think my first science project in school was making cheese, kind of like a halloumi cheese, and basically, I think the project was adding more salt. So you make one batch with no salt and make one batch with half the amount, one with the normal amount, then one with twice the amount of salt, and then measure the amount of bacteria that survived, which decreased as the salt increased. And through the work that he did, most of his students would have gone on to work in the bigger dairies. Ireland is full of milk and cows and cheese and butter. So there's obviously, and ice cream, so a lot of people have gone to work at ice cream. A lot of the microbiological students that he taught also got into brewing, so he would have sent a lot of students off to Fuller's over here. One of his students was Fergus Fitzgerald, who's the head brewer at Adnams.
Right, really?
Yeah. And so, he would have set up that first placement for Fergus at Fuller's, I believe. But anyway, he also knew a lot of the smaller cheesemakers in Ireland, of which, like in the late 70s, there was kind of slightly ahead of its time, but there would have been no small cheesemaking in Ireland. But a lot of people in the late 70s kind of moved to the West Coast to kind of, escape the city and do something a bit different with their lives. And a lot of them sort of, well, not a lot, but quite a lot of them, I suppose, set up dairies making cheese in southwest of Ireland. And actually, I don't know, is it perhaps slightly random, but of, say, the 12 or 15 Irish cheesemakers in the south of Ireland at that point in time, it seems like about 10 of them had kids that were my age, so the next generation, and we all ended up going to the same school together. So I knew a lot of these cheesemakers in Ireland through their kids, or through my dad, or through eating the cheese. I moved to London in January 1999, so there's 20 years. There's another anniversary to celebrate.
That's why we did the podcast now.
There you go. And I didn't have any. I just finished college. I'd spent 6 months traveling, and then moving from Ireland is quite small. So first step when you leave Ireland is you stop in London for a bit, and I never left. But I just looked around for a job, and there was a job going at as a cheesemonger in Neal's Yard Dairy in Covent Garden. So I went in and dropped a few names, and they were like, "You know so and so," and I was like, "Well, I know their daughter." And it worked.
So where were you selling to? So you're working for Neal's Yard Dairy and then going to restaurants?
I worked at I just worked in the shop, so I just did retail. I ran the shop in Covent Garden for a few years, and then when I spent 8 years doing a master's and a PhD, so I used to just do that on Saturdays. So I was there for 7 years in total. And then I got asked to run a friend's cheese stall in the Borough Market, so I was there for another 3 years after that. So I sold Caerphilly cheese.
Just Caerphilly?
Yep, just Caerphilly. We just had Caerphilly from Llandowie Breffy in West Wales. At that point is where it was made, made by the Tallons. And so the stall just sold Caerphilly. That was good.
And did you during those? So that's 10 years in the cheese industry in London. Is that right?
It was probably 11. I miscounted somewhere.
Right. Did you see a huge upturn in the fortunes of the cheese industry during that time? Was it? I feel like a stall that only sold Caerphilly, you'd have to have a pretty broad audience to be able to make that a business.
The fortunes of a stall like that, I think, are more specifically tied up with what the Borough Market was and what it has become. I mean, I think the first inklings of a Borough Market kind of were around 1999 or 1998. They did a few one-off little pop-ups, like once every 3 months or something, and then it became once a month and blah, 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 blah. But the period I was there from when was probably 2006 or 6 to 2010. Around 2006, 2007, it started getting really busy, but really busy with people who were actually still coming to shop. And then as it got more and more popular, it got really busy, but really busy with people who just wanted to hang around or take photographs.
Have a taster and take a photo.
Precisely. Yeah. Or to get a takeaway burger or coffee or beer or whatever, and they stand around and get in the way of anybody who wanted to go shopping. So, at a certain point, it just kind of started suffering from the weight of its own popularity, which is, it's not necessarily... It's a very hard thing to deal with, I mean... we had a tap room here that we had to close because it became too popular to function. So, they're all, these things happen. There's so many, I'm sure, of your favorite bars or restaurants that are become too busy. You can't even get a table there anymore or whatever, Or the locals that made the place great can't get in because so many people are coming from out of town just to go and see what the fuss is about.
Yep.
So Borough Market suffered from that. But at a certain point in time it was, because we were there, selling cheese. There's a Comté stall that just sold Comté. There was a Stilton stall that just sold Stilton. There was... The focus of those sort of producers was really quite tight on one specific thing. And if somebody does one specific thing,
they do it really well.
Yeah, because otherwise they wouldn't be doing it anymore.
So
they'd be out of biz.
Was it just a best in shoe Borough Market at the time then? Just you go down and it really just had the best of the best?
There was enough really, really good things. And there still are. But there was always a bit of, filler and stuff like this. And there was also a kind of there were people who were there who had been trading there for maybe generations before that, who had specific spots in the market that they had special leases to, and there was no way of being able to influence what they would do. So they could just basically sell whatever old crap they wanted, and there's just choices that people make that kind of serve as short-term making a bit of money, rather than how can we build this whole thing in a long-term and a sustainable way. Now, the market still asks itself that question a lot, and they have been doing a lot of work to try and figure out what the focus of the market should be and how it should move forward. But there was a period of time when maybe the management wasn't quite as focused on what as it should be.
Yeah. Less on the long term and more.
Yeah, I think it took everybody by surprise because that sort of the way that area was gentrified. Now you would kind of look at it ahead of time and you'd know exactly what was going to happen. But then it just took everybody by surprise. So there's a Borough Market Trust which owns all the land and the buildings around there, and it was really run down and nothing was happening. And suddenly the market made it really popular. Suddenly they could charge more money for rent. Suddenly they had loads of money. But it's a trust. What can it? They kind of. They really wanted to make a lot of money, but then they realized, well, we're a trust. None of us can make a profit from this. This, what's the point of it? What do we do with this money once we've made it? And that's still the question I think they ask themselves. But then, of course, that changes other things because they used to be quite a job looking after the market, but now looking after their property portfolio is a far more significant thing because that's for them now is that's where the money is.
Yep.
But then I suppose they have to kind of also think about how the market affects the value of the property around there. How it raises its value by having that market there in a way that's healthy and functioning as part of a community, not just as an attraction for tourists.
One of those things where you start with one job and then 10 years later you're like, this wasn't what I applied for.
I didn't sign up for this. How did we get here?
Property management, yeah.
I love that stuff. Been drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. I heard they recently decided to add more hops to it. Hops to it. I heard they recently decided to add more hops to it. Hops to it. Chica, yeah,
Yeah, well, so we talked about the Lancashire. And you talked about how cheeses, it's very hard to recreate that crumbly texture that you're enjoying there. And you said that you can't really do that elsewhere either. So is there huge variation around the world in the cheeses that are made? You said you don't know much about French cheese. Is it that different? Because I feel like it's a bit like beer where people don't realise how different beer can be until you really get involved and you're like, oh, well, there's hops from these places. There's millions of kinds of yeast. There's different styles that are historical and not.
There are. At least with cheese, it's geographically slightly more specific because there aren't that many. It's like 80% of the world don't really have the gene to allow people to produce lactase, which allows us, generally Western Europeans, to digest milk. Most, all mammals lose it after weaning, and apparently most humans do too. So, the cheese making, any sort of dairy consumption is really limited to Western Europe, northwestern Europe. And a few other places like, Maasai in Kenya, or there's certain other cultures where milk drinking is still part of adult life. In terms of the animals used, that varies. If we just stick with cows and goats and sheep, there are other possibilities, but they don't come up quite so often. Different type of land will lend itself to different type of animals. The bigger and steeper the mountains get, you have less cows, you have more goats and sheep. Certain places have historical reasons for favouring one over the other. What we are left with now, I suppose, is hugely dependent on the history that some place has gone through, in the sense of England went through industrialisation a lot earlier than, say, France or Italy. So the effect of industrialisation has had a longer impact on British cheeses, and in certain ways pushed the historical memory of how to make a certain cheese further away from people's minds, whereas that might not have been the case in Italy or France. The other thing as well, which you find, Italy, France, places where like the traditions in the mountains tend to be really strong. because mountains aren't really. You can't really build a factory in a mountain. The mountain places and mountain people tend to hold on to they're also inaccessible, so they have less interaction with the outside world, less exchange of ideas, and maybe because of that or despite that, mountain people tend to hold on to their traditions more strongly. So we don't have quite anything quite like the Alps here, but each different valley in the mountain can be adjacent to another one, but actually getting from one valley to the other is hard, which means that over a period of time, one valley will do a cheese like a Comté, and the next one will do a very similar cheese in a Gruyere style, or the next valley will have one called Abondance, and the next one will have a valley and will be Beaufort, and they're all very similar recipe cheeses, but each one will have its own unique signature. And that becomes slightly because of just the geography and the terrain of the mountains kind of keeping people slightly separate from each other in this case, although they're all making a similar, in a sense, style of cheese.
Yeah.
So Comté kind of can stand in for a lot of different hard mountain cheeses, which have that similar sort of, that sweet, dense textured, nutty sort of flavors. They can appear in many different forms across all these different cheeses made in the mountains, either in France or in Switzerland or in Austria or north of Italy. With brewing, the history that we're left with now is most particularly it's an urban phenomenon. It's an industry. Whereas a lot of the cheeses that we're talking about here are referring back to something that was the way things were done before industrialization kicked in.
Yeah, because there must have been loads of people loads of different industries that were like the cheese industry you just described. So beer, back when you wouldn't have had access to hops from all around the world, you'd have used... I always love the story of Gose about how the water they were using was salty. So Gose, they adapted what they were brewing so that the salted water worked for them. Yeah. And then obviously on a different river around the corner, it wouldn't have been anything like that. It would have been a Berliner Weiss, which has the lactic quality but doesn't have the salt.
Yeah. And so, we don't, like most of our tradition in terms of pale ales, IPAs, porters, stouts, those sort of things have been domesticated to a certain degree, that we have yeast that can now do that fermentation in 4 or 5 days, whereas if you're leaving things to wild yeast in the lambic style, then you're putting something in a barrel and leaving it there for 3 years before you'll consider touching it. Apart from the lambic style of making beer, that's for a brewer is probably one of the few points of contact with a culture that predates something industrial.
Yeah. Are there wild cheeses being made?
But I mean, I know what you're coming from. There's no wild beers being made anyway either, right, in the sense that they're not really. I mean, there's so much physical and man-made intervention into all of these processes that it's kind of like in cheese making. You have to make certain choices that are going to dictate what the cheese is going to come out like. So if you, even at the point of it being milk, if you just leave the milk, it'll just curdle.
Yep.
Which you could call cheese if you want, but it's not necessarily going to be very tasty. It might approximate something like yogurt if you're lucky, but to get it into something that we recognize as cheese involves specifically doing things to it. So if a curd appeared in your milk spontaneously, which is possible but kind of unlikely, you would then have to decide what to do with it. So depending on how you treated that curd, you might end up with something more like one of those pyramid-shaped soft goat's cheeses, or if you cut it up really finely, you'd end up with more of a cheddar texture, or if you treated it more gently and loosely, you could get something like the texture of a blue cheese. So in order for it to become cheese, you have to address it as a human being and make a certain decision. So it can't just happen wild in the sense of naturally.
Yeah. So in that case,
now you can let So we were talking earlier about starter culture bacteria. There are ways of allowing whatever natural starter culture bacteria are in the world around you to get in your milk and allow that to do the initial acidification. It's very difficult to get anything either obviously consistent, but that would be more kind of similar to the way in which a lambic brewer will, put their wort into a cool ship and leave it out into the, for the elements to, drop their wild yeast into it. The thing about cheese making is then there's always pretty much always a second step, at least with these sort of cheeses, would all have rennet added to them. And rennet is an enzyme that's traditionally got from a calf's stomach, which basically coagulates liquid milk into solid proteins. So in order for cheese to happen, you have to have that phase of turning the liquid, which is the milk, into something solid, which is the cheese, and is done now by the addition of rennet. So, I mean, there are other ways of doing it slightly, but none of them. You still have to have a process of somebody adding something. It won't happen spontaneously. Yeah. So there isn't. It's like with anything, even when we talk about wild beers, there's still, the man-made intervention is always a huge part of it.
Yeah. So how is
and that's, like if you look at some of the wine world, some people talk about natural wines, which is a slightly ridiculous word. But then, talking about organic food is a slightly ridiculous, because organic means something specific that exists independent of how something is grown. But, people will talk about low intervention wines, which, if you know something about how that's produced, kind of leads you to think that, certain things are let, happen on their own course, rather than having somebody coming along and telling that wine exactly what to do. And that's part of the joys.
It doesn't roll off the tongue quite as easily, though. The
intervention wine.
No intervention wine, but it might take off.
But you see it around.
It might be a slightly crass question, but so there's the story rolled out about how most alcohols were made, or rather discovered, and it's usually by accident. How would cheese have been discovered if it's got so much intervention in it?
By accident.
Right.
Most likely that, it's probably just that somebody's, like a stomach of an animal, a mammal, was used to carry some milk around.
And it turned solid. And
for whatever, it hit the right kind of interaction of certain random circumstances so that the stomach would contain the rennet. Stomachs would have been used and sewn up to carry things in, liquid, assuming they could be made, sewn tightly and made watertight. If you're thinking a few thousand years ago, there really wasn't much else one could make.
Fewer plastic shopping bags, yeah.
Precisely. Yes. You've got the agitation as well by somebody carrying it around on their back, maybe a bit of heat from being out in the sun. All those things are kind of... These days, if you're making cheese, you're controlling the temperature of the milk, you're controlling the amount of stirring and agitation that's going on, of the milk to begin with, etc., etc. So, you can maybe just guess that something like that happened.
Open up your sheep's stomach to unveil your milk, and you've got a camembert sitting there.
That's exactly how I picture it.
All you need is an
there
oven,
are still
some garlic.
cheeses being made inside animal stomachs. So
really,
I think is it a Georgian tradition? Yeah, I think in Georgia or Central Asia, anyway. Somewhere.
Well, if we put the innards of a sheep inside a sheep's stomach and eat it once a year, then I don't see why that's any weirder by the Georgians there.
No, not weird at all.
Beer break.
What have we got here?
Another pail. This one, I think, is Galaxy Mosaic.
Oh, glorious.
Oh, delicious.
Loads of, almost strawberry from the Mosaic. Really, really fruity Mosaic.
Yeah, and the Galaxy's been quite dank this year. So it feels like it doesn't stand up quite so much as well as on its own, but something fruity like Mosaic with it might help.
Yeah. Cheese and beer. Are you one of these people that is like... Because some people are like, no, wine's always better with cheese. Some people always like beer is better with cheese. And some people are like, well, it depends what you're bloody eating. But
there are very, 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 very few red wines that work well with cheese. Just the tannins and the weight, I find, don't work at all. Whites can be universally good in many ways.
Yep.
Beer does have more breadth in terms of different flavors and different ways it working together. But I personally tend not to like to be prescriptive about such things. Just, if I run cheese and beer tastings, which I do on occasion, we'll just put down 5 beers and 5 cheeses and we'll taste through them all together and
say, we'll see you after the coma.
Yeah, exactly. Figure out what we like, And there might be a wine in there too, or there might be a cider or whatever. It's... with beer, you just have, with beers like pale ales or IPAs, it's mostly the bitterness you have to worry about. It can be quite harsh on certain cheeses, especially if the cheeses themselves have a little bit of bitterness in, which often, the rind can often have a certain bitterness, especially with softer mold-ripened cheeses. And those things can, if you have bitterness upon bitterness, can just amplify things into a slightly awkward degree. The same a little bit with the bitterness you get in stouts, but it never seems to be quite as much of an issue because, with the dark beers, as long as they have enough body, then the sweetness and the caramel and stuff just work really well. But something like the Comte is the sort of cheese that works really well with a pale ale or an IPA because it's got enough sweetness to bounce off it. It doesn't have any bitterness, and just such a generous kind of that fudgy sort of texture with something like that usually works well.
Fudgy is the right word. I tried someone was really struggling. I was like, that's gorgeous. I kept thinking of golden syrup, I think. Just something wickedly syrupy about it.
Mm. Yep. I see what you mean.
So we haven't actually talked about how I knew you were a cheese lover, which is the origin of Kernel has a slight link to cheese in that it was during a trip that you discovered American beer.
Yeah, I'd finished working for Neil's Yard. I think this was in 2007. And I was working in the Burr Market. But Neil's Yard approached me and asked if I would go to the States for a month to help one of their customers over there set up a cheese shop in their shop. This was Whole Foods Market in the Lower East Side, Manhattan. So I went over. It's not a bad gig, get paid for doing 6 weeks work in New York. They put me up with some friends in Williamsburg, which wasn't a shabby spot either. It blew my mind. One of the guys who I met there, who was working at the Whole Foods at the shop at that point in time, is still working with us here now. He's been here for 7 years with us, which is nice. So we actually have 4 ex-cheesemongers amongst our staff, like professionals.
Hence
never mind the ones. Yeah, never mind the ones that just eat cheese because they like it. We have professionals. But in America, when I was over there, I would spend the day, teaching the guys at the shop all about the different cheeses and where they come from, who made them, what sort of ingredients went into them, what the historical importance of this recipe was, how it related to, the land that it came from, or the different pastures that the animals were feeding on, or what made one cheese better than another, or different than another, or why this one was better at this age, or maybe you might want to try it a bit younger, or whatever. And after we finished work, the guys would take me for a beer, and we'd go literally about 2 blocks away. There was a bar called DBA's in the Lower East Side, which, for somebody coming from London to find a rock up somewhere with like 40 or 50 taps, with everything that we probably think is kind of completely normal now.
Especially in, what was it, 2007 you said?
Exactly. It hadn't happened here yet, but it was already kind of on its way, swinging in the States. And they just would kind of pull a couple of beers off and recommend some, and then tell me, well, this is made by this brewer and to this recipe in this place. And I had the mental structure that I could understand it all, which I'd never had those bits of information put in there before. So it was like, well, this makes complete sense. A beer has an origin in the same way that a piece of cheese does. It's just I never knew anything about it. I just kind of thought it came out of a tap on a bar. And if it was dark, it was Guinness. And if it was flat, it was real ale. And if it was pale and watery, then it was Foster's or Carlsberg or whatever. So you realise there's a whole world out there that you never thought about. And it's just kind of like, and that's what blew my mind, is that, we can apply everything we know to thinking about beer in the same way we've done about not just cheese, the other food. We mentioned the Borough Market before, but that whole, cheese is only part of that whole movement of people looking to, take a bit more care and attention into what they eat, into what they drink, into the things they put in their bodies. And you could see that at that point in time in London. When Borough Market started in 1999, there might have been 1 or 2 other farmers markets, maybe none. And then, 10 years later, most boroughs have one or two
every
Saturday.
weekend in a school playground. Yeah.
Oh yeah, exactly. There's one up near me every Saturday from 10 till 2, and it does really well. There's places that have been going for years now, and they've become part of a community and a hub. But they weren't around, and those sort of places obviously gave a market to small producers who just wanted a different way of dealing than kind of selling what they make through a supermarket or things like that. So that sort of movement had been happening here. It was happening in beer in America at that point in time. Small breweries were springing up for about the previous 10 years. Whereas cheese hadn't quite yet taken off there. Still struggling. Cheese in America is a slightly hard sell.
I mean, it's literally American cheese is literally a thing that is derided the world over. Just the phrase. So
yes.
From a marketing standpoint, even
exactly, American cheese is like one step up from that cheese in a tube.
Yeah,
I'm sure you can get American cheese in a tube too if you really want. But
the sort of artisanal cheese making, when did that come about? You sort of discussed earlier on that after the war and during the war, they basically realised that you could upscale cheddar production, so a lot of milk was just going into cheddar production. So when did it recover after the war, and when did people start experimenting a little bit more with cheese again?
It's on an upward curve now. I think there's probably more new dairies opening now in the last 5-10 years than there have been previously. I'm not too sure about the timeline of certain things, but the oldest kind of there are 5 or 6 producers at Neal's Yard who I know their processes kind of survived that whole what's the word, the shortages, I suppose, of World War II. So things like the Crookham's Lancashire would have like Graham learned that from his mum, who would have been making those recipes before the World War, probably on her own farm, or she would have been working for somebody else. And so there were 2 or 3 cheddar makers who would have had a traditional way of making cheddar that would have again have stretched back. Applebee's Cheshire would have been probably another one. There weren't many more though. I mean, 20 years ago, maybe quite a large proportion of small British cheesemakers would have been represented in Neal's Yard's shop, and there might be 50 cheeses or something, which is a large number. I think maybe a bit less. Maybe 40 was the optimum number. But now that might be 10 or less % of the amount of artisanal cheesemakers out there. Like, they now get to be able to pick and choose the ones they work with, whereas before there wasn't much of a choice. There were only 4 small artisanal cheesemakers in the country, so you're going to buy their cheese, aren't you? So, but there would have been a slow increase from the 60s or whenever the rationing sort of stopped. 50s. But then again, there's also a whole pattern of people maybe, industrialization kind of promised a lot to people. But then obviously all the jobs and things started appearing in cities, countrysides suffering depopulation and stuff like this. And it's only more recently that kind of things have been set up to address this. Like, there are more incentives now, I think, to set up a business in the countryside. Like, if you want to set up a brewery, there's certain parts of the countryside where you can get, grants and things to help, bring jobs back into rural places. So I think, and also, people who have gone through a certain amount of time living in a city and then realizing that actually maybe they'd like to live in the countryside, having, maybe worked here, made some money or whatever, and then moving out. It's probably a more recent phenomenon too. So a lot of people who are kind of setting into kind of taking over some of these sort of cheeses don't necessarily come from a cheese-making background, but just have been inspired to do that for
the proper good life story.
Partly, or else they just like the cheese or whatever. But it's there's probably a split now. Maybe there's only about 10% of the old English cheeses that maybe have a direct lineage back to some time before the Second World War.
And are these companies, like you said, that it's very hard to recreate that texture, particularly the Lancashire, on an industrial scale? Does that hold back cheese from becoming a bit more mainstream? Because obviously, if you go into a cheese section of a supermarket, it's bleak viewing. Is that because it's so hard to create large batch quality cheese?
I mean, so if we're talking about brewing, we have an economy of scale that when you start brewing at larger batches, you can make things at a cheaper price. And brewing does scale compared to cheese making. It scales much more easily. So if you want to make something on a small scale, to a certain degree, you can scale up the size of production and not necessarily affect the quality negatively too much. There's plenty of very, very, very large breweries that we all know that can make really, really good beer. That's not quite possible with cheese making. So if you're talking about something that's being small and handmade in an artisanal sense, its affordability is not going to be something that will see it on a supermarket shelf regularly. B, consistency as well. Might be something that's not as repeatable as an industrial cheese. And the third thing is it will require more looking after. If you have a mass-produced cheddar that's been wrapped in plastic since the day it was born, then it living its life in plastic in your fridge is not going to be an issue. Whereas if you put something like this in plastic in your fridge, it's 5 days later, it'll taste like plastic, and it'll sweat, and it's not pleasant. So in that sense, I suppose it's a bit like something like cask ale, something that needs looking after. You need to have the right people at the point of dispense looking after it. If you have a piece of cheese that's a bit tired, you have to trim off the dry bits on the outside. You have to be on top of how each cheese is tasting. In the same way that if you're looking after your cask ale cellar, you want to check, how long has this beer been on? How exposed to oxygen has it been? Is it going to pull through? Are we going to sell it today, or should we pull it off and whatever? There's a separate issue, I suppose, is slightly more to do with how industrial cheese making can make things so cheap. If you get used to milk being, or cheese or butter or whatever being as cheap as it is in a supermarket, and you start asking yourself, how is that possible? In a sense, it's not really. We pay the costs of all that sort of production through environmental degradation, for example, that we'll end up paying more money to try and help the environment recover from the practices of
you're just shifting the cost elsewhere,
corporate farming. Yeah, exactly. But that's a whole other kettle of fish.
But the French are able to have quite a good selection. Is that just a different model where they're buying from local producers, and the turnover is probably quite quick in France, where cheese is probably a table staple every meal, really?
The culture, that cultural relationship between cheese and people, I suppose, is it's stronger there. Again, without industrialization, they kind of push people further away from the land. It didn't happen in the same way in France as here. So, there's more different cheeses with specific local roots and origins around available to people, and people, have it as part of their culture growing up, just in a way that we had lost here. And the same, I grew up in Ireland, so there's no, apart from Guinness, there's no, not even a drink that you have a relationship to. Whereas here, there are still places that you could grow up and still have been drinking, say, Batham's Bitter from, if you grew up in Wolverhampton or something, that has a tradition that your father might have drunk and your grandfather. And that,
My dad's his beer d'or, so he went French. That's depressing.
That's no good. Employment law in France means that people are generally paid better and have slightly more. Like, cheese does not seem as expensive in France as it does here, but that's to do with a lot of reasons, to do with either perhaps subsidies or to do with, but even it's just to do with also what people think something is worth. If you grow up thinking that the price of a kilo of cheddar in a supermarket is normal, then everything here on this table is going to seem really expensive.
Yep.
Whereas if you grew up thinking that that's normal, well, then that's normal. If you go down to if you go to Madrid, somewhere where you find legs of Spanish ham hanging in a delicatessen, which is somewhere that everybody will shop, and they'll have ham that costs £10 a kilo, and they'll that costs £200 a kilo, and everything in between, depending on what you want to spend. It's just there as part of somebody's culture. It's not something that somebody would even blink at. It's just, what do I want today?
Yep.
And a lot of the time we've had that choice removed by industrialization, which is just driving down prices and driving down quality. In beer also, as in cheese, I'm sure you've come across the odd person who decides that anything more than £5 for a pint, for example, is outrageous. No, maybe these people.
Oh, no. It happened to me at lunch today. I was sat there having a beer, and somebody was moaning about this beer costing $6.50 a pint, and it was an 8% beer. So I was like, "That's a bargain." But the guy next to me was like, "That's an outrage." And yeah,
exactly. But there has been the bastardization of beer and cheese, evidently, where it was a sea of continental lagers on the bar. They all cost between £3 and £3.50.
Premium was a matter of like 3 or 4%, not
and people didn't
3 or 4 quid
want to spend any more on that. And we work so much with Belgian beers, and you see all these different strengths and the weird and wonderful, and they are a lot more willing to pay a little bit more if it's a different beer, whereas we're finding our way now, definitely. And the craft beer scenes help that, and the same with cheese. But when you go into a supermarket and you see a lump of cheddar and it is that cheap, then it's obviously hard for people to make that realisation that actually cheese can cost 10, 20 quid.
Yeah. And I even find myself quibbling when I'm buying some cheese in the supermarket and you see that one's 50p more than another, and you start to quibble. You start trying to price save on 50p for some really crap cheese that you're only getting in to put on top of a pasta bake or something. It's mad.
The thing is, with any of those questions, you can't really make a decision until you know what's actually behind that.
Yeah.
Is it just marketing that makes this one more expensive? Is one just being priced differently for reasons of, I'm a premium product, so I'll be reassuringly expensive.
Yeah.
Or is there a reason that you should know about, that this, one's made by a factory, one's made by a farmer or whatever. But it's without having that information, it's just really. I mean, that's why when you want a good beer, you go to a specialist beer shop. You go to a pub where the people know what they're putting on. If you want cheese, it doesn't really make sense not to go to a specialist cheese shop.
When I first moved to London, I remember it was 2012, and the first day I moved here, I walked into a bar and there was a pint on for £7.50, and I couldn't get my head around it. And I was like, if you ever catch me spending that amount on a pint, and then fast forward like 6 months and I was doing it.
You spent it on a third.
Could you guess what the beer was?
Cheers.
Punk IPA.
No, it was a Kernel IPA.
Oh, was it?
What? Really?
And it was delicious.
That was a bargain.
I drove over to the Sonic Drive-In, ordered a jalapeno burger, washed it down with beers, beer, I said, Stone Cold, why have one when you can have them both?
The other thing that comes into play, I think, and it's a truism when you're having beer or wine and cheese. Certainly that that a wine that comes from the same area as a cheese, or a cider that comes from the same area as a cheese you're eating, they tend to work. And because most of the cheese we eat tends to be British in origin, it's undeniable that they tend to work better with British styles. If you kind of Charles Darwin's diaries on the voyage of the Beagle have him, celebrating any special occasion with a lump of Cheshire and a bottle of porter, those sort of things. Did we cane all the Lancashire? I better get some.
I think you did.
We'll go with Stilton instead.
I just had the
Lancashire.
But just our porter, we put too many New World hops in it, so it doesn't always quite work for English cheese purposes. It works in every other way possible. But the export stout, that's actually what we're brewing today. So it kind of works because you can smell it. You can smell the
it's everywhere, isn't it?
Coming from there. But those sort of beers, just that thick, rich, sort of with that the slightly smoky, slightly leathery, tarry tobacco sort of overtones with anything kind of old-fashioned and English, sort of Lancashire, Cheshire. But they're quite generous to any hard cheese. So even the cheddar, or I haven't tried the blue yet actually. So
it works with the export stout. It makes the export stout really sweet.
Stilton
really rounds off the roast.
Yeah.
So after your trip to America, back in 06, 07?
07.
It was obviously 2 years until you got the brewery going. Was it just sort of the sheer inspiration of sort of what you saw out there that sort of led to it?
Yeah.
Because
that was one thing. The other thing was, the first thought was, so where's this back here? And then the second thought was, well, it's not really. So we'll have to build it. It's not that it wasn't. It's, the places in London to find good beer in those days were the Rake. Quite a few places focused on, say, importing. There's a good, decent Belgian places, the sort of places that, maybe your traditional places like the Dove in Hackney or things like that. They've been around for generations. That were good places to drink good Belgian beers. But, of the contemporary sort of breweries that were starting or had just started that were good, it was impossible to find, So if you wanted some Dark Star or Thornbridge or... Brewdog just started April 2007, so that's just when I was in America, so they wouldn't really have been available. But, if you wanted some Dark Star or Thornbridge...
Yeah, I wouldn't know.
They're out there somewhere, but where?
Yeah.
Or how? The White Horse would have had a lot of American beers on and a few other things. But it was just... you could look or you could not look, or, you might stumble across something, but there wasn't anywhere that was particularly
inspiring.
Not consistently.
Yeah. Nowhere
certainly in terms of British beers and in terms of something local and fresh. That's the first lesson you learn when you come back from the States is, oh, hey, there's that brilliant IPA I tried in America, and you grab a bottle and you drink it and you go. And it took me a while to realise, oh, that's what's wrong with it. It's 6 months old. These sort of things. It took a while for that all to register. And the fact that London had 10 million people living in it, and 5 breweries? 6? Who was around in those days? Young's had left, so there was Mortlake brewing Budweiser, Fuller's, meantime, Twickenham, Sandbrook's had just started. There's 5.
Is it Pitfield Brewery? Were they?
I don't know, were they there or are they gone? I think they'd left already, because Mark was already brewing at Dark Star in the basement of the pub in the Evening Star in Brighton. So I think they'd moved out.
Brody's? When did they start?
Brody started... Yeah, no, they would have been from the year before we, so about 2008 they took over. So in a city that big, it kind of felt like there should be somebody there who'd like to drink my beer.
So you were probably the first in London that was doing the American...
It's just because we didn't know any better.
Right.
We didn't really didn't know anything else.
I'd had this stuff in America, so I'm going to do that.
That's beer, isn't it?
Yeah. You naively reroute the rule book and beer production for the UK, really, because no one else had done anything like what you created with a pale ale, with experimenting with different hops.
Punk IPA was out. I remember discovering that just when I got back from the States, and that was an eye-opening revelation. It was really fucking amazing in those days. Thornbridge were around doing good beers, and Dark Star.
I mean, more from the sort of
I mean that
recipe way.
Yeah. I mean, when I was homebrewing, I used to try and clone Sierra Nevada, and then as you go along, you realise that your clone is just completely, most Sierra Nevada clone recipes have lots of crystal malt and Munich malt and various other things like that. I think very close to the very beginning we just dropped all of the coloured malts. So our pales and IPAs are just Maris orders, nothing else. Mm-hmm. And with the hops, it was just really, when I was homebrewing, I could get access to like 5 different hops. And then when I became a commercial brewer, even on 600 litres, you can call up Charles Farm, and then they have like 40. It's like,
oh god.
okay, we'll have 5 kilos of each, please. And then that's the only way we had to find out. We could have done a test batch, but it was like,
may as well just make it.
I mean, it's only 600 litres. It's the whole joy of having a small system. So, I mean, okay, if you're starting off, you don't really want to make a mess of anything, but at the same time, it's a hop. It'll probably taste okay. Let's try it. So that was just us trying to get to know different ingredients and different hops and things. Then we discovered at the end of the first year, when the new season hop came in, that they all tasted different. So we went through the whole process again. And so then that's still what we do. And still we come across hops like Green Bullet we've never used before. There's one here called Idaho Gem. We have a bottle in front of us, which is the first time we've used that hop. So, there's always new things. But obviously the process is something you want to try and work into some sort of... You want things to progress and develop. So, the hops that we enjoy the most, they tend to come back. Mm-hmm. Because it's not just a willy-nilly scattergun approach of trying lots of different things, Something like Galaxy Mosaic, that we love those hops. We'll use them again as often and often.
And then you moved. Well, actually, I think a lot of your homebrew stuff was stouts and that side as well. That maybe didn't at the start get you the name. You got the name for the pale stuff, but you were still producing those stouts. And now we just had a quick look at the amazing dark room when time stops. Where all your wild stuff is happening. Is that a sort of a going full circle and going back into where you started with the cheese and where your dad being a microbiologist and stuff like that? Or was that another beer discovery rather than a cheese-related theme?
It's probably a bit of both. I mean, certainly the way we look at beers that are maturing in barrels and the way we look at mixed culture fermentation beers, I think my approach would be closer to the way I would have approached cheese than the way I approach brewing an IPA or a pale ale. Like with an IPA or a pale, we do tend to... Beers like that we tend to try and control the parameters in order to get a certain effect. We want a beer like this. I mean, we're quite generous. We don't have these specific targets that we want the beer to taste the same each time. That's part of our enjoyment of it, is not to reproduce ourselves directly. But we have a certain idea often of what we would like to achieve. And we can control that by controlling temperatures, controlling fermentation, controlling ingredients and things like that. Whereas the stuff that we put in through mixed culture fermentation and through barrel aging, those things mature in a way that's much more similar to cheese. So, for example, if we wrapped that Comté in plastic and shoved it in the fridge and left it there for 2 years, it would be a 24-month-old Comté. It wouldn't have any maturation in the proper sense, because proper maturation needs breathing, needs interacting with its environment, means like losing moisture, getting more dense, and certain processes happening. An analogy would be, if we had a beer like the pale ale left in a bottle, it's sealed. It can't really mature. So basically the only thing that happens after 2 years is that beer gets older and tastes more stale. It's not a happy process. Whereas the mixed culture fermentation and the barrel aging allows a maturation to happen, because the wood allows air to come in and out. The wood holds things that... It holds wild yeast, holds bacteria. It allows them to mature and develop through subsequent generations, because they'll survive in a barrel from one batch to the next. And so basically we end up reacting to what those barrels are doing more than telling them what to do. So both in terms of kind of a healthy growth and development over time, and in terms of our relationship with it, it's a much more balanced dialogue of kind of tasting a barrel, thinking about it, whether it's in terms of how it might blend, or whether it's in terms of what sort of dry hops this might enjoy, or whether it's ready or whether it's not. We can't directly affect the end result in the same way we can with a pale ale or an IPA. So yes, in that sense, it is closer to how we would have been maturing cheese at Neil's Yard. But the impetus doesn't necessarily just come from cheese making. It's because there is a beer making tradition that leads to beers like, Cantillon Gueuze or whatever, that, the things that we really enjoy drinking. Every brewery has to kind of struggle with that question a little bit, but to try and kind of develop within your beers a sense of place, a sense of where they come from. So specifically with those cheeses, the translation between what the animals are eating into their milk is there, and the milk into a cheese is there. Beer kind of muddies the waters a little bit because it's harder to get a direct correlation, because ingredients are brought in from far away, because we're using a municipal water supply, which isn't necessarily the most exciting thing in the world. But for us to kind of develop a sense of place in what we do, those sort of mixed culture fermentation beers and beers that sit in barrels that have held generations of beers before is something that we like to think allows our beers to taste of themselves in a way that means they're from here. They're from this railway arch in the Kernel brewery specifically, and could not really be repeatable anywhere else. And I think that's something we take specifically from cheese making that informs our brewing of these beers, and that is part of the reason that we enjoy all these other mixed culture fermentation beers from wherever they come from, because they express a unique sense of place.
Let's talk about beer, Johnny. Let's talk about AVB. Let's talk about Imperial Stouts and InBev buyouts of wicked weed. Let's talk about beer. Let's talk about beer. Let's talk about beer. Let's talk about beer.
So when we started this podcast, it was all about trying to get out the bubble and find out what other people think. But that was a slight cover for what I have, which is a fascination with how beer, and particularly the craft of different things, feeds into everything else. So the threads that he took from understanding cheese that fitted just like a square peg in a square hole talking about beer was fascinating to me. And it's one of those things where you just unlock that keyhole and everything sort of falls into place. So we could do the same, and I hope to with wine, with whiskey, with gin, all these different worlds where you think they're entirely different, but the people making them are thinking the same things, even if the ingredients or the scene or the thing that you do with it completely changes.
Yeah, it really amazed me how cheese is sort of even more artisan than craft beer, because he talks about how you can't upscale it, and you can really tell the nuances between different cheeses just from where it's from. And he discussed with us, the hills in the French Alps, and how from valley to valley the cheeses are sort of similar because they're from similar cows, it's similar pasture, but it's ever so slightly different because of how it's handled.
Yep.
And those tiny differences in handling can make a difference to the cheese, be it shape or texture or how much it's being worked. And you can really see that in sort of Kernel's beer as well, that the tiny nuances, and they really paved the way in the UK for me as far as never really brewing the same beer twice, because they wanted to work with the hops that were fresh at the time, that were right at the time, that they felt would maybe blend well, and they're constantly sort of tweaking and changing, which I know maybe a lot of breweries do, because a lot of the craft breweries tweak their recipes a little bit, but they do it so sort of obviously in your face.
Yeah, one of the first rules you're sort of told when you found a craft beer business is you've got to have a core range. You've got to be recognisable for something. And what Kernel have achieved, even outside of his wild beer, is that you can taste a Kernel beer and know it's a Kernel beer. It somehow has a sense of place, and yet he's broken every rule by never really producing the same beer twice.
Yeah, which is insane. And we talk about how, this year is their 10-year anniversary. So in 2009, when they started, the marketplace was not what it is today. It's so much smaller, and I think that step was so much braver, because Punk IPA. There's a couple of other breweries knocking around at that point. Not even Camden existed. Yet he's like, I'm not going to have a core range.
Yep.
I'm going to just change the hops, and I'm going to make my badges on some floor tiles. Doesn't get much more artisan than that.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting. We're always trying to define craft, and I'm not saying that I'm going to do that now, but no. But there's this interesting process where a new fad or a new industry kind of crops up, like craft beer did, and what happens is capitalism comes in, money comes in, and they try to machinate everything. They try to make it a production line. And, so he's watched Camden, Beavertown, Thornbridge maybe, or maybe they slightly... No, they were before Kernel.
They were before.
But lots of breweries who have come along in the wake, inspired by what Evan's done, learned his craft, then slowly taken the human element, the time element, and the place element out. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for the craft beer industry as a whole, but it is kind of bad for that brand because he's still producing something unique and of a place and of a time, and not quite handmade, but still it feels to me like an artisanal thing he does, whereas the others have upscaled it. And I'm not saying they've become Cathedral City Cheddar, but they've become a different thing to what he's doing.
Yeah, completely. I actually find it very interesting, which is not something I've thought about before, about how that you can't really upscale cheese in the same way, and that is why Cheddar has become so big, because
you can kind of upscale it.
And he has sort of put that approach into how the Kernel has been ran, and I don't think they've produced any more or less beer for the last 3 or 4 years, although that might not be 100% factually correct, but they certainly haven't grown huge amounts or shrank. But they've just got to a size that they find sustainable, and they can continue to work at that rate without having to really alter things like some people have. They've become the Cheddar.
Yeah. There's going to be some brewers out there going, am I a Cheddar brewery now? What else did you learn about cheese?
I think what I sort of really took away from it is that Lancashire cheese was one of the best things I've ever eaten in my life.
Yeah, I learned I really like Comté. But I think, kind of feeding into what you said about how you can't upscale it, it was the stuff you can't control in cheese is so much. Like, if it were a beer, it would be like, well, we can't really control, can't really 100% control what grain goes in or what temperature, or what speed the rake will go round. And then we don't really control the hops. We know when they go in, but we don't know how long we'll have to leave it. It's totally mad to think that could be a viable business to run, where you're just like, well, we just throw our hands up in the air and go.
And wait.
Yeah, exactly. Wait and hope. And that's why they don't change much.
But I loved talking about it, and he was like, yeah, that's why people don't experiment as much with it, because you're invested in quite a lot of time, because if you experiment too much and then you wait a year or two and it's like, oh yeah, this one's a bit shit, actually, you need to throw it in the bin.
I've been working for quite a long time, I should be coming out soon, on a story about lambic and how people have finally started experimenting in lambic, because up until maybe 5 years ago no one did, because you had to wait 3 years to get the result. The people who were drinking it were pretty conservative in their tastes, like they love Gers, they love Kriek, they love Framboise. That's about as far as it goes. And Cantillon were the only guys that really sort of pushed it. But then Tilcan came along, got people like Boccareda. And I also spoke to the Baghaven part of McKellar, where they're doing lots of interesting stuff, and Ub Beersel, who have an insane range of different beers sort of in development. But of all of those, they've probably got 5-10 in development. One will appear in the next 2 or 3 years, and then another one will. And cheese is probably the same way. It's just got to move so much slower, because you don't know whether it's worked for years, and most of them fail.
Yeah, I know that's the sort of good thing about the beer industry, especially sort of the pale ale market. You can churn it out so quickly. So, I mean, you might need to bin bits and pieces here and there, but you can get it right, you can get it going quite quickly again. Whereas you're invested in so much time and energy and skill into making cheese that you kind of don't want to mess with it too much.
Yeah, beer's a bit like, I don't know, like a 100-metre sprint. You got some people going, woo, and then you got a fat bloke in lane 8, and that's the lambic just sort of pottering along, going at a different speed. And he's still beautiful to watch in a terrifying kind of way.
But yeah, really fascinating chat, and a big thank you to Evin for having us over to the Kernel. I had a great day there, drinking their beers and eating some really fantastic cheese.
Yeah, guys, huge thanks to the original Haysboro in Evin, and it was an absolute privilege to sit down for a couple of hours and talk beer and cheese. We don't know what our next episode is, but we will announce it on Twitter fairly soon after this podcast so that you guys know. If you've got any suggestions, do get in touch on @beerchannel and youtube.com/the craft beer channel, and of course check out beermotions.com if you want to buy beers on the internet. That's a business plan. That's literally what it does.